Hi everyone! Tonight's video is an introduction to biological macromolecules. I always find at the beginning of a course on biology that students are really confused when we dive in and start talking about biological macromolecules and their structure and what their function is. They don't really have an understanding of the big picture of what are these macromolecules and what do cells use them for. So that's what this video is designed to give you, is more of a big picture overview of the function of these biological macromolecules in building cells. So these biological macromolecules are the materials used by cells to build all the cellular structures. Much like a home builder would have to use some cement for the foundation and wood for the framing and glass for the windows, cells use these macromolecules to build membranes and small organs inside of cells called organelles, and for interior scaffolding. They also use these macromolecules to store energy and to store information. And finally, they use them to move substances in or out of the cell or move structures around inside the cell, and in some cases, they can even use these macromolecules for entire cell movement. So these macromolecules are large organic molecules, organic meaning they are composed of carbon and have at least one carbon-hydrogen bond, and they're 50 to hundreds of carbons long, such as one pictured here. Now, 3 out of the 4 classes of macromolecules are polymers, and polymers are composed of repeating subunits called monomers. If you need a review of polymers, I encourage you to watch the polymers and polymerization video on this channel, and perhaps pause this video until you have watched that video. The final category of macromolecule is not a polymer, but it is still considered a macromolecule because it's large. Macro meaning large. So what are these biological macromolecules? Well, we have proteins, nucleic acids, polysaccharides, which fall under the category of carbohydrates. And I want to pause here for a moment because this is a little bit confusing. There are carbohydrates that are not polysaccharides. They are smaller molecules and they're not macromolecules. So we would consider them carbohydrates, but not polysaccharides and not macromolecules. So when I am referring to carbohydrates in this video and when I'm talking about macromolecules, I am really talking about polysaccharides. They're really large carbohydrates. These 3 classes of macromolecules, proteins, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates, are polymers. They are composed of repeating subunits. The final class of macromolecules, the lipids, are not polymers. They are macromolecules because they are very large molecules, but they're not composed of repeating subunits. They're just composed of different subunits, and they are very, very large. So what are some examples of some structural macromolecules? Well, all cells and most organelles are surrounded by something called a membrane. And this is indicated here in orange in this picture of the cell. This cell membrane surrounds the entire cell. There's also a membrane surrounding each of the labeled organelles in this cell, so the nucleus and the mitochondria and the Golgi apparatus. These membranes are composed of a type of lipid, which is one of our classes of macromolecules, and this lipid is called a phospholipid, pictured here on the left. Remember, lipids, and therefore phospholipids, are macromolecules, but they're not polymers. So this membrane that is composed of this lipid called a phospholipid, it's a structure around the cell and around the organelles that keeps some things in and some things out, kind of like a plastic bag. This plastic bag pictured here has some green beans in it. The green beans cannot freely pass through this bag, and most biological substances also cannot freely pass through a membrane. So we've seen that a lipid can be a structural molecule, but are all structural macromolecules lipids? No, they're not. Plant cells have a structure called a cell wall outside of their cell membrane. That's pictured here in orange. And the cell membrane is pictured here in this kind of sky blue. Remember, the cell membrane is composed of a lipid called a phospholipid, but plant cell walls are composed of a carbohydrate, that's a polysaccharide carbohydrate then, and it's called cellulose. Cellulose is pictured here. The plant cell wall helps plants maintain their shape because plants have no bones. Here's a fun fact. Cellulose has a really unique chemical bond structure that neither animals nor plants can digest, which makes it a great compound to make walls out of because you don't want to digest your walls. So structural molecules can be made out of proteins too. Cells have an internal scaffolding called a cytoskeleton, and it's made of the macromolecule proteins. So much like our bodies have a skeleton to help us maintain shape, cells have an internal scaffolding called a cytoskeleton, and that helps it maintain the cell shape, and it holds organelles in place. It can also provide tracks for organelle movement within the cell. In some cell types, these internal cytoskeletal structures are also involved in the whole cell movement. So we've seen how structures in the cell can be composed of lipids or carbohydrates, and again, I'm specifically talking about polysaccharides or proteins. But what about the molecules that cells use for energy storage? What are they composed of? Well, cells use different classes of macromolecules to store energy depending on the cell type. So plants use a polysaccharide, again, that's a carbohydrate, called starch to store energy. Animals use a different polysaccharide or carbohydrate called glycogen to store energy. It's pictured here. So you can think of energy storage molecules as saving for a rainy day. Literally for plants, they can't photosynthesize sugars when there's no sunshine. So on a rainy day, they have to use their stored starch for energy. So a fun fact, both starch and glycogen look a lot like cellulose that I showed you on the previous slide. They're both made of the same monomer, glucose, but the chemical bond structure is different, which allows animals to digest both starch and glycogen, and plants can digest starch. In addition to using the polysaccharide glycogen, animals also use a lipid called a triglyceride to store energy. So a triglyceride is shown here. Again, this is not a polymer. Triglycerides are what we often refer to as fats, and they're stored in lipid droplets in cells called adipocytes. So this cell here is called an adipocyte, and it is surrounded by a membrane, which is composed of a phospholipid. And inside, it has what's called a fat droplet or a fat reservoir, and that is full of triglycerides, which we use to store energy, and that is a lipid. So cells also have a need to move small vesicles around inside a cell, move substances in and out of the cell, and make chemical reactions happen in the relatively cool temperatures of the cellular environment. What macromolecule is involved in this process? Proteins. So sometimes there are organelles or small things that need to move around inside the cell, and there are motor proteins that are able to move these objects along using the cytoskeletal tracts of the cytoskeleton, which we said was composed of proteins also. If you look at a cell membrane, in addition to finding those phospholipids, you would find embedded proteins in that membrane. And those embedded proteins can be transport proteins. They're transport molecules, and they can form channels in the membrane that allow things to flow in and out. Remember, our membrane is kind of like a plastic bag. It controls what can go in and out. So we have proteins that are special channels in those membranes. And then finally, there's a special category of proteins called an enzyme. And these enzymes catalyze chemical reactions. By catalyzing, I mean make these reactions happen. The temperature of a cell is relatively cool for the chemical world, and so enzymes are needed to make these reactions happen in the relatively cool temperature environment of a cell. So what about nucleic acids? I haven't talked about them yet. What do they do? So nucleic acids include DNA and RNA, and nucleic acids store information. RNA and DNA are composed of 4 different monomers. They're polymers. The monomers for DNA are A, C, G, and T. The monomers for RNA are A, C, G, and U. The order of these monomers comprises the genetic code, and this code tells cells how to make proteins. Proteins then make all the rest of the macromolecules. So how do we summarize the functions of biological molecules? There doesn't seem to be any clear pattern for what type of molecule does what type of function. We can either categorize them by function or by class, so I'm going to do both for you. So first, let's categorize them by function. So if we start with structure, the function of structure, we have lipids, specifically phospholipids, that form cell membranes. We have proteins that form the cytoskeleton. And we have carbohydrates that form plant cell walls. If we look at the function of energy storage, we have lipids, triglycerides are able to store energy, and we have carbohydrates, starch and glycogen can store energy. Again, these are polysaccharide carbohydrates. What about movement and chemical reactions? Well, that's the job of proteins. And then finally, information storage, that is the job of nucleic acids. So how about now if we look at it by categorizing by class? If we just look at carbohydrates, and again, I'm specifically talking about polysaccharides, they function in energy storage. That's the role of glycogen and starch, but they can also be structural, such as cellulose in our plant cell wall. What about lipids? Lipids can function in energy storage, as are triglycerides, but they can also be structural, the phospholipids in all cell and organelle membranes. Proteins, what's their job? Well, they can do cell and organelle movement, they can form membrane transport channels, they can catalyze chemical reactions. All of these are very active functions, but they can also be structural in that they form the cytoskeleton. Finally, our nucleic acids, and those are for information storage. So the only clear pattern here is our nucleic acids, who only have one role. But each of our other classes of macromolecules have multiple roles. And this makes it very difficult for students to wrap their mind around, because there just doesn't seem to be as clear a pattern as many of our students would like. But we will now dive into studying each of these individual classes of macromolecules individually. We will talk about proteins and their subunits, and what is the bond and what is their function. And then we'll move on to carbohydrates and what are their subunits and what is their function and what kind of animals make them and what type of plants make them and where do we find them and who can digest them. Now that you have this big picture look at biological macromolecules, it should be easier to understand the details of the individual classes. There are videos on this channel for each of these individual classes of macromolecules, and we will also cover them in the class. So that's all for tonight.